Welcome to a GED math lesson. Today we are working with fractions. So we're going to go over some review of basic terms you need to know. Then we're going to cover how to add and subtract fractions. We'll finish up by multiplying and dividing fractions. It sounds like a lot, it really isn't. To start with, I've got a sad true story for you. The true sad story of a misunderstood burger. Multiple fast food restaurants like McDonald's have a quarter-pounder burger. A couple of years ago, one fast food joint decided to compete by selling a third-pounder burger for the same price. So it sounds like a pretty good deal, right? You get a third-pounder burger for the same price as the quarter-pounder. However, the fast food place lost money. People didn't buy the burger. So why didn't people want a third-pounder burger for the same price as a quarter-pounder? Well, it's a sad commentary on people's fraction skills. People thought that a third was smaller than a fourth. So what was their mistake? Can you identify it? Well, if you understand fractions, you know that 1/3 is larger than a fourth. What people were doing is they were focusing on the denominator and they weren't realizing that the one denominator was larger than the other, but the numerator was the same, which meant that, in fact, you were choosing to spend the same amount of money for a smaller burger. All right, so getting into fractions, let's do a review of the basics. I got a fraction here for you, 2/3. What do we call the top number in a fraction? Hopefully, you remember that it's called the numerator. And can you remember what the bottom number is called? That is the denominator. Make sure you know those two terms, very important terms. You really can't do well on the GED math if you don't know these basic terms. Okay, a couple other terms we got to make sure you know. What is an improper fraction? All right, hopefully at least an improper fraction or an example of it could pop into your head. You may not know how to put this into words. If you were going to define it, you could simply say it's a fraction where the numerator is larger than the denominator. It's a fraction, in other words, that could be simplified further. It could be turned into a mixed number. So what's a mixed number? Well, hopefully you remember a mixed number is when you have a whole number followed by a fraction, like 1.5 would be a mixed number. Now, if that were written as 3/2, that would be an improper fraction. When we convert a fraction to a decimal, do you remember how to do that? You divide the top by the bottom. It's very easy. Just think of a fraction as being a division problem that hasn't been solved. So all you got to do is divide the top by the bottom. So in this case, 2 divided by 3. And you would end up with 0.67. Actually, you would get 0.6666666, and it would just continue on with an infinity of sixes. So we would round it. Now, the following is a sample GED test question. A list of numbers is shown. 1/2, 0.6, 4/5, 1/8, 0.07. Which list shows the numbers arranged from smallest to largest? And they would give you 4 options. Now, if you see a question like this, it's actually not very hard to solve, but you do have to do a few things first. You're going to have to get all of your numbers either as decimals or as fractions so that you can figure out which is smallest to largest. And the easiest thing is to convert them all to decimals. So let's convert these numbers all to decimals to compare them easier. Here's our list. 1/2 we could write as 0.5. 4/5 could be written as 0.8. 1/8 could be written as 0.125. So knowing that, which list shows the numbers arranged from smallest to largest? What do you think? Look at them for a minute. And hopefully you picked A. Let's move on. Simplifying fractions. So the truth about fractions is if they're too big, they are a pain in the butt to work with. For example, 12 over 36 is needlessly hard to work with. You start getting into 2 or 3 digit numbers and it just kind of hurts your head. So when we work with fractions, we like to simplify them whenever possible. In other words, finding the smallest form of that same fraction. All you have to do to simplify a fraction is divide the numerator and denominator by their highest common divisor, which means the biggest number that both can be evenly divided by. If you can memorize your times table, you will have a much easier time doing this. If you don't have your times table memorized, you're probably going to have to write this out or try to do it in your head, and it's really a waste of time and it's kind of needlessly frustrating. You'll do a lot better on the math test if you do take that time to memorize the times table. Oh, and if you are a Shelton student who's taking GED online, you have access to a times table in your Google Classroom. I've actually put one there for you under math. Feel free to make use of that. So let's simplify our sample fraction that we mentioned of 12 over 36. The largest common divisor of both those numbers is 12. So if you do 12 divided by 12, 36 divided by 12, see you're dividing both the top and the bottom by the same number. And we end up with 1 over 3, or 1/3. 1/3 is a lot easier to work with than 12 over 36. Definitely less painful. Now, if you don't have your times table memorized, you may find it harder to find the largest common divisor. If at all possible, again, try to memorize that times table. I know some students really struggle with memorization, so here's 3 tips for making this process easier if you don't have the times table memorized or if you feel like you can't do that. If you have an even numerator and denominator, divide both numbers by 2 to start with. Because if they're even, they will always be divisible by 2. See if you need to go further after you've first divided them by 2. Maybe you have to do it again. Maybe you have to do it a couple times. It's perfectly okay if it takes you a couple steps to simplify. Nobody is ever going to know. It's your little secret, so don't feel bad if you need to do it in more than one step. If you have 1 or 2 odd numbers, try dividing by 3 to start with. It won't always work, but sometimes it does. It's a good place to start. And if both your numerator and your denominator end in either 0 or 5, it's always going to be divisible by 5. So start by dividing by 5. So let's simplify another sample fraction. Let's do 12 over 50. Those are both even numbers, so why don't we just divide them by 2? 12 divided by 2 gets us 6. 50 divided by 2 gets us 25. So 12 over 50 becomes 6 over 25. And look at that, it's already simplified. We can't take it further. Let's simplify another one. 9 over 75. I know it's not a very pretty fraction, but let's work with it. Since those are both odd numbers, let's start by dividing both numbers by 3 and see if that works. 9 divided by 3 gives us 3. 75 divided by 3 gets us 25. 9 over 75 becomes 3 over 25. Oh, look, it's already simplified. We can't take it further. Great. So let's do just one more. 15 over 50. Since one number is odd, why don't we start by dividing both by 3 and see if that works? 13 divided by 3 gives us 5, and 50 divided by 3 gives us no. We end up with a decimal here, and you need a whole number. You can't have any kind of decimal happening. So 50 does not divide evenly by 3. That didn't work. Let's try with a different number. So 15 divided by 50. Oh, look. Both numbers end in either a 5 or a 0. So let's divide both by 5 this time. 15 divided by 5 gives us 3. 50 divided by 5 gives us 10. Look at that. 15 over 50 becomes 3 over 10. And that's already simplified. Okay, next, let's work on adding and subtracting fractions. What's nice about adding and subtracting fractions is you basically use the same process for both. The only difference is on one you add, on the other you subtract, but you follow the same basic steps. So the first things first, when you've got two fractions and you want to add or subtract them, you have to have the denominator be the same. So that 3 and that 4, they've got to be the same number. You're going to have to change these fractions. You're also going to find it easier if you write out your fractions as a top and a bottom rather than being side by side on the numbers. So let's take a look at these written out that way. 2 over 3 plus 1 over 4. We can't just add right now. We've got to get ourselves common denominators. The same number on the bottom. Now, in this example, we know that 3 and 4 are both divisors of 12. In other words, they both go into the number 12. So let's just change the fractions to make 12 the denominator for both of them. To do this, you have to multiply both the numerator and the denominator of the fraction by whatever number is necessary to get the denominator you need. So for that first number, we want the denominator to be 12. We need to multiply the numerator and denominator by the same number to get us a denominator of 12. It doesn't matter what the numerator is. An important note, the number you multiply with for one fraction isn't going to be the same number you use for the other fraction. So for our first fraction, 2/3, in order to make that something over 12, we need to multiply by 4. So 2 times 4, 3 times 4. Now for that second number, we can't use 4 because that would get us a denominator of 16. So instead on this number, we use 3. 1 times 3, 4 times 3. See what we're doing? And because if you don't know your times tables, it might be hard for you to figure out right off the top of your head a number that both of your denominators are divisors of. In that case, just multiply one fraction by the denominator of the opposite fraction. So in this case, 2/3, we're multiplying both of those numbers by 4. That's the denominator of the other number that we're dealing with. So you can see we're already doing this. So it's just a simple matter of adding the numerators. 8 over 12 plus 3 over 12 gets us what over 12? 11 over 12. Now, important note, don't add the denominators together. If you do, you'll end up with 11 over 24, and that's a smaller number. So you will have added and yet wound up with a smaller number, which is very, very incorrect. So only add the numerators. So again, remember, if you don't have the times table memorized, if you can't figure out a number where both the numerator and denominator are divisors, just do each fraction by the denominator of the other one. So let's try another example together. 5/12 plus 2/5. All right, so step 1, we need the denominators to match. So let's multiply our first number by the denominator of our second number, which is 5. 5 times 5, 12 times 5. On our other fraction, we're going to do the exact same thing. So in this case, 2 times 12, because 12 is the denominator of our other fraction, and 5 times 12. which we will then add. So we're doing 25 over 60 plus 24 over 60, and that gets us 49 over 60. It's not the prettiest of fractions, but it can't be simplified further, so that's our final answer. Now to subtract, you follow the exact same process that you use when you add, except for that final step where you literally subtract instead of add. So 7/8 minus 1/5. Step one, we need to make the denominators match. So we'll multiply those first two numbers by 5. And what number do we multiply our second two by? If you said 8, you are correct. And so step 2 is we're going to be subtracting. So 35 over 40 minus 8 over 40 is going to give us 27 over 40. And here again, it's not a pretty fraction. It's bigger than we probably like to see, but it is simplified. So you can't simplify it further. All right, I got a couple more examples for you. Now pay close attention to whether you're being asked to add or subtract. And I want you to do these on your own. 4/9 plus 15/18. Sorry, I know it's not pretty. 3/4 minus 2/7. 1/2 plus 1/5. 5/6 minus 1/8. So if you need to, pause the video here, do these problems on your own, and then start the video when you're done, and I'll give you the right answers. All right, so hopefully you took a little break and did these problems yourself, because this is good practice. You should have gotten 7 over 24, 7 over 10, 1 over 5/18, 1 and 5/18, 13 over 28. All right, another story for you. This is based on a true story. The name has been changed to protect the poor guy who got a wrong number. So while building a house, Frank needs to write down exact measurements for another man to cut. One board will need to be exactly 10.5 feet long. So Frank thinks to himself, there's 12 inches in a foot, so half of that is 6. He then writes down 10.6 feet. What was Frank's mistake? Think about this for a minute. Now, if you don't see a mistake in this, then you need a little bit of review on fractions and decimals. So the problem that Frank did, when he was converting, he was focused on the fact that there are 12 inches in a foot and half of that is 6. But see, he didn't take into account that decimals are based on the number 10. So half is not 0.6. Half is always going to be 0.5. He should have written down 10.5 feet. And realistically, on a building site, it actually would have been better if he'd just written it as a fraction, well, as a mixed number, but that's beside the point. By writing 10.6 feet, the person who cut the board ended up being off on the measurement, and it meant a lot of extra work later on. And yes, this is a true story. So here's a little pro tip for you when you're working with fractions. A lot of people struggle with fractions because they find it hard to picture them mentally. And that's often why people struggle with math in general. They don't really have mental math happening. So if you try thinking about fractions in terms of something tangible, like cooking measurements, it may make fractions easier for you to conceptualize in your mind. This is what I do because honestly, I'm not great at math. But I can work with fractions because I picture them as being half a cup or half a teaspoon. And even though the problem may have nothing to do with cooking, because I'm picturing it as something concrete that I understand, it helps me to work with the fractions. On to multiplying fractions. Now, if you've been out of school for a while, multiplying fractions might sound really scary and you might think you can't do it. Here is the exciting news. It's actually easier to multiply fractions than it is to add or subtract them. Seriously, it's actually easier. What does it mean to multiply by a fraction? When you multiply a number by a fraction, you're actually finding part of that number. So if you multiply 6 by a half, what you're actually doing is finding half of 6. It gets a little trickier if both numbers are fractions, but the idea is still the same. So anytime you're multiplying a number by a fraction, you're finding part of that number. If you're multiplying 1/4 by 1/2, you're literally finding a half of a fourth. Now, the reason I mention this is because when you multiply by a fraction, you end up getting a smaller number. When you multiply whole numbers, you end up with a bigger number. So sometimes students get confused when they're multiplying fractions because the answer is a smaller number and they think they've done it wrong. Don't be fooled. If you get a smaller number, you probably have done it right. Now, just to help you conceptualize, you definitely don't want to follow all these steps every time you're multiplying fractions. But let's look at a picture of what we're really doing. So if we're trying to figure out half of a fourth, let's look at a picture of the fraction 1/4. The fraction 1/4 means the whole item has been divided equally into 4 pieces, and you have one of those pieces. All right, so picture this. This is 1/4. If you were going to find a half of the fraction shaded below, you would need to split it down the middle. So what is 1/2 of 1/4? By splitting that box down the middle, you now have 8 equal boxes and you only want one of them. The answer is now 1 out of 8 pieces, or 1/8. Now, for some of you that did not help at all, but some of you that were more visual, that may have helped. And obviously, drawing this out every time you work with fractions would be pretty silly and it's a giant waste of your time. So let's look at how you do it as an equation. You multiply the numerators together and you multiply the denominators together to get your answer. So just like we did with adding and subtracting, it's really easier if you write out your fractions like this, top to bottom. And all you got to do is multiply straight across. So you know that 1 times 1 is 1, and then you do 4 times 2, and you get 8. So 1/4 times 1/2 equals 1/8. This fraction cannot be further simplified. So again, you multiply straight across, multiply your numerators together, then multiply your denominators together. Lastly, simplify your answer if necessary. Let's do another one. 3/8 times 5/7. 3 times 5 equals 15. 8 times 7 equals 56. This fraction cannot be further simplified. Now, if you're like me and you get a fraction where it's 2 two-digit numbers, I really, really want to simplify it. It looks wrong to me. The fact is, it's actually correct. So don't let your own mind deceive you. Let's do another one. 2/9 times 5/6. So all we got to do is 2 times 5 gives us 10. 9 times 6 gives us 54. 10 over 54. And this fraction can be further simplified. So let's start by just dividing it by 2 and see what happens. 5 over 27. Okay, that's simplified. All right, so that's how we multiply a fraction by a fraction. But let's look at multiplying fractions by whole numbers. What do you do if only one number is a fraction and the other is a whole number? Really easy. You change the whole number into a fraction by using 1 as the denominator. Dividing by 1 does not change a number, so any whole number at all, can be rewritten with 1 as the denominator. After you've written the number as a fraction, follow the usual steps for multiplying fractions. So if we were doing 3 times 2/7, you would write it out as 3 over 1 times 2 over 7. And we just do the same process we've been doing. Go straight across. 3 times 2 equals 6. 1 times 7 equals 7. We get 6/7. Can that be simplified? Nope. What about multiplying by a mixed number? One or both of the numbers you're multiplying might be a mixed number, which remember is a whole number with a fraction like 1/2. Before you multiply, you first rewrite your mixed number as an improper fraction. So basically you do the same thing you do for a whole number. And the rest of the steps are going to be the same. So 4 2/3 times 1/9. 4 2/3 as an improper fraction is going to be 14 over 3. And now we just multiply straight across. And we get 14 over 27. And sadly, it cannot be further simplified. Okay, dividing fractions. Here again, this is really, really easy, even though students sometimes think it's scary. If you can multiply fractions, you can divide them. And as I said, multiplying fractions is actually easier than adding or subtracting them. Dividing is the same easy process, there's just one extra step first. So it's not hard or scary at all. Allow me to introduce my little friend known as reciprocals. This is an important vocab term you should know for GED math. So fractions have this really cool feature. If you take a fraction and then you swap its top and bottom numbers, so like 2/3 and you swap it to 3 over 2, if you multiply those two numbers, you get 1. So here's an example, like 3/4. If you swap it to 4/3, you then multiply those two numbers, 12 over 12, which would be 1. Why that's important? When you reverse the numbers, like we did here, that's known as the reciprocal. All right? So the reciprocal of a fraction is your ally in the dividing of fractions. To divide fractions, make sure you have 2 fractions to start with, just like in multiplying. So if you have any whole numbers, you've got to turn them into improper fractions first. Any mixed numbers, turn them into improper fractions. Now, this next step is important. Turn your second fraction, not the first one, the second fraction, into its reciprocal by switching its top and bottom numbers. Don't do anything to your first fraction. You're then going to multiply straight across. Yes, I said multiply. And then you'll simplify if needed. 3/5 divided by 1/2. First, we need to turn that second fraction into its reciprocal. So what's the reciprocal of 1 over 2? 2 over 1. Now, we don't want to divide anymore, so we're going to get rid of that. We're multiplying. 3 times 2, 6. 5 times 1, 5. And you'll notice we can simplify this answer. 1 1/5. See how easy that was? Let's do another one. All right, 7/8 divided by 5/16. So first we need to turn that second fraction into its reciprocal. Swap those around. And remember, now we are multiplying. 7 times 16, 112. You may have had to use a calculator for it. That's fine. 8 times 5, 40. We can simplify this answer. And if we simplify it, we're going to get 2 and 32 over 40, we can actually simplify that even further. What's the highest common denominator of 32 and 40? 8. And so if we divide by 8, 2 4/5. What about dividing a fraction by a whole number? So let's say we're doing 1/3 divided by 2. First, we need to turn that whole number into an improper fraction. All right. Next, we turn that second fraction into its reciprocal. And now we just multiply straight across. 1 times 1 equals 1. 3 times 2 equals 6. So 1/3 divided by 2 is 1/6. We can't simplify this answer, so we're done. And what about dividing a whole number by a fraction? 18 divided by a half. First, we need to turn that whole number into an improper fraction. So we do 18 over 1. Next, we turn that second fraction into its reciprocal. Doo-doo. And of course, we want to multiply, not divide. Now we just go straight across. 36 over 1. We can simplify this answer. 36. All right, little review Q&A. What do you need to do first whenever you want to add or subtract fractions? Think for a second. What do you do first? Make sure the denominators are the same. Do you need to have the same denominator when multiplying or dividing fractions? Nope. Just go ahead and multiply or divide them. Don't worry if the denominators are different. Which part of the fraction do you add or subtract when you're adding or subtracting fractions? The numerator only. Don't touch that denominator. When multiplying fractions, which numbers do you multiply? Numerator times numerator, denominator times denominator. Go straight across. Which fraction do you change to the reciprocal when you're dividing fractions? The second fraction only. What's the last thing you need to ask yourself when doing anything with fractions? Your final step. Can I simplify this answer? All right, that finishes us on fractions. Hopefully you found this helpful, and hopefully you've realized that fractions are not as scary as people sometimes think they are.